Here is a question. What do you do when you lose a large chunk of your navy in just one battle? That was something the Japanese had to think about in the aftermath of the Battle of Midway. After all, they lost 4 fleet carriers in one engagement. That one battle dropped the Imperial Japanese Navy down most of its aircraft carriers. They had only 2 fleet carriers left in Shokaku and Zuikaku, along with assorted light carriers of various utility, from the almost fleet carriers Hio and Junyo to the outdated Ryujo and Hosho. As a result, this devastating loss prompted some serious planning by the Japanese. They already had the Unryu class under development explicitly as a cheap and fast option. But in addition to this, they set about making more conversions. Both planned conversions, like Chitose, and more emergency conversions. Today's video will focus on those, specifically the Ise-class, Ibuki, and Shinano. I've covered all 3 before, so this video will be more of a compilation. In that regard, we'll begin with the Ise sisters. These were 2 of Japan's oldest battleships, alongside the Fusos. All 4 were broadly equivalent to each other, which isn't very surprising. The Ises were, after all, initially intended to be a second pair of Fusos. It also means that when the Japanese were looking for ships to convert, both the Fusos and Ises were considered. These ships were outdated and of dubious utility in their original role. As for the choice to use Ise instead of Fuso, well, that comes down to 2 reasons. First, there were issues with the stern turrets. Those couldn't elevate as high on Ise due to the ship's design, which was something of an issue. The Japanese wanted to fight long-range engagements, and the ships couldn't bring their entire main battery to bear. While the second reason actually also relates to those turrets. Hyuga suffered a massive turret explosion in her number 5 turret in May 1942. That turret was destroyed and never replaced. The combination of those factors made the superior ships marginally less capable as battleships, at least to Japanese eyes. So the Ises would be chosen for conversion in the aftermath of Midway. Initially, this would take the form of a full-on conversion. The Japanese envisioned ships that could carry and operate around 54 aircraft, although they would be on the slower side. The basic hull form just couldn't get that much faster no matter what you did in the conversion. Take the only other battleship conversions to aircraft carriers. Kaga was designed for around 26.5 knots as a battleship. Once converted, she could manage around 28. HMS Eagle, meanwhile, was intended for around 22 to 23 knots as a battleship, and could manage around 24 as an aircraft carrier. As for Bayarn, well, there's not really much to say there. She was slow in either design. While there's no firm details on a full conversion, I imagine Ise would be somewhere between Eagle and Kaga. That is, however, just a guess. The lack of firm details is because this concept was rather quickly dropped. It was simply too expensive and time-consuming for too little gain. Even the more conservative rebuild that the ships actually received took from February to August of 1943. A full conversion would likely have taken upwards of 2 years. So, with this in mind, What did the Japanese decide on? Well, a halfway conversion. The aft pair of turrets were removed, with the stern built over by a small flight deck and hangar, which came out to 70 meters or 229 feet long, with a width of 29 meters or 95 feet at its forward end. This narrowed down to 13 meters, 42 feet at the stern. That flight deck was fitted with 2 catapults for launching the ship's aircraft, with Ise intended to carry around 22, 11 D-4Y Judy dive bombers, and 11 E-16 Paul floatplanes. However, the flight deck was far too small for landings, so the Judys were intended to land ashore or on a proper aircraft carrier. Beyond this, the ships remained mostly the same. They still had 4 of their turrets for 8 14-inch guns, while their original secondary battery was replaced by 8 127mm 5-inch twin mounts, for 16 guns in all, along with the usual swarm of 25mm morale boosters. What this resulted in was a ship of questionable use. The stern was now a big target in any sort of surface action, with serious fire and explosion hazards. The catapults also limited the firing arc of the amidships guns. In both regards, it was the classic issue with any battle carrier. A ship that was more vulnerable as a battleship, and a ship that was only marginally useful as an aircraft carrier. Except in Ise's case, even marginally useful would prove rather optimistic. Both ships were only properly back in service by the start of 1944, after their conversions began in early 1943, by which point the Japanese were running low on pilots for their actual aircraft carriers. Ise and Hyuga would never carry aircraft into combat. In the end, they would both be sunk in harbor in July 1945, with their most notable post-conversion action being Cape Engano in October 1944, where they joined the rest of Japan's functional carriers as bait to draw in the Americans. Ultimately, the Ises serve mostly as an example of how desperate the Japanese were. That said, we've wrapped up these ships. Now let's look at a different facet of Japanese conversions in the form of Shinano. Shinano is an interesting case. This conversion was, at least initially, less out of desperation compared to Ise. You see, Shinano was the third of the Yamato-class battleships. She was built to a slightly modified design, with the largest changes coming in the secondary battery and the armor protection. The armor was slightly thinned down in comparison to her sister ships, while the secondary battery was swapped out on a 1-to-1 basis. 6 twin 127mm 5-inch mounts on the older ships, replaced by 6 twin 100mm mounts on Shinano, clustered around the superstructure in both cases. Beyond this, the ship was identical to her sisters, at least in theory. Shinano would never be completed to this design. The ship was laid down on May 4th, 1940, with her construction progressing in utmost secrecy. So secret that no surviving photographs have turned up of this process. A process that was not quite fast enough. The Japanese expected the ship to be complete by around 1945, late 1944 at the absolute earliest, with the dramatic success of air power in the early Pacific War, this ship was seen as a bit of a waste. It was a lot of dock space, raw materials, and workforce tied up in a ship they didn't need. As a result, the Japanese chose to complete the ship just to the point of launching. They could clear her slipway for more valuable construction, while pushing the question of what to do with Shinano to a later date. Or so the plan went. The workforce was reduced, with a launch expected in 1942, only for the Battle of Midway to intervene. With the loss of most of the Kido Butai, the Japanese shifted their approach again, into something that's actually interesting when you look at the other conversions. The Ises are a sign of desperation to get more flight decks in the water. Shinano is almost the exact opposite. The Japanese saw themselves with enough carriers either built or under construction. Shinano didn't need to be converted into a traditional fleet carrier. Instead, the Japanese would turn the ship into a massive support carrier. HMS Unicorn writ large, if you will. Shinano's massive hull would be used for carrying spares as well as repair facilities. She would sail around providing those spares for the main fleet carriers, while her own air wing would be around 42 aircraft. Nowhere near what this ship could theoretically operate. Honestly, I'm not joking when I say Shinano and the Ises make for an interesting comparison on Japanese priorities. That said, Shinano never had the chance to put her aircraft to use, so there's at least that similarity, I suppose. Shinano was launched on October 8, 1944. Work continued on her hull until November 28, 1944, when the Japanese had her set sail. They had been spooked by a B-29 overflight of the dock on November 19th, and wanted Shinano to sail for Kure to finish fitting out. This proved to be a poor choice. The ship wasn't complete, and this doomed her. She would take 4 torpedoes from USS Archerfish around 3 a.m. on November 29, 1944. The ship would ultimately capsize and take 1,435 men down with her. Another conversion that, in the end, saw no use in her intended role. Then again, at least Shinano was mostly completed. You can't say the same for our final example in the form of Ibuki. This ship and her class began as improved takes on the Mogami-class cruisers. Or rather, the Mogamis after they were modified into heavy cruisers. Another attempt, like the Unryus, at creating a cheap and quick solution to a need for more ships. However, events would overtake Ibuki and her sister ship in short order. Ibuki, warship number 300, was laid down on April 24th of 1942. Her sister ship, warship number 301, was laid down on June 1st and scrapped on June 30th, 1942. As initially designed, the only major difference for these ships was in the torpedo tubes. Mogami carried triple tubes, while Ibuki carried quadruple mounts. That's really about it. The hull form was largely the same, as was the armor protection and the main battery. As noted, though, the ship never got close to carrying this weaponry. Ibuki was in the early stage of construction when Midway hit. The Japanese quickly suspended work, just like Shinano, to figure out what to do with the ship. And again, much like her larger counterpart, this resulted in a decision to launch as quickly as possible and clear the slipway. This would see the ship launched on May 21st, 1943, where she was suspended again until further plans could be worked out. Among other things, there was an argument to complete the ship as a high-speed oiler. In the end, however, the choice was made to convert Ibuki into a light carrier on August 25th, 1943. This would see half the power plant pulled out, reducing the ship to 29 knots in speed, with the freed up space put to use for aviation fuel along with magazines for her air wing, while the ship would receive a new superstructure in the form of a hangar and a 205-meter, 672-foot long flight deck. This would have allowed the ship to carry around 27 aircraft, which was admittedly in line with other Japanese light carriers, not particularly superior or inferior to the existing conversions, which I suppose isn't a bad thing. Ibuki would have been a better conversion than the Ises, to be sure. However, this conversion was never completed. Ibuki's conversion continued until March 1945, but in the end, she only reached around 80% completion, with the ship's construction halted to divert limited resources to more critical construction, kind of similar to the final Unryus in this regard. In any case, Ibuki would survive the war, only to be scrapped from November 1946 to August 1947. She was probably the overall best of the emergency conversions in this video, but also the one furthest from completion. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere. Regardless, I feel these three examples give a good spread of how the Japanese tried to adapt to the Battle of Midway, from desperate battle carriers to a weirdly not desperate support carrier, and a cruiser that would have made a good match for an independence and is, as such, the closest to the Allied idea of an emergency light carrier. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one. Also, apologies for how rough my voice is today.